What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show. You talk about the brutality of the seas back then, and you talk about how it was normal for guys to be missing a limb, not even pirates, like you said. And, you know, I think the phrase was being in the Navy was like prison, but you're on a boat or something. Or on
right,
the sea.
Much like prison, but with the added possibility of drowning.
Yeah, there you go. Well, there you go. So, if you don't mind, like what was it? What was a standard trip like back then? If I wanted to go, forget pirates for a second, just if I'm with the British Navy and I want to take a trip from the west of the UK across to Nassau, how many, in the early 1700s, how many days am I looking at? What size of ship am I traveling on? How many people would be on this ship? Was it strictly using a compass, or were there other methods they had? Like, just I'm always thinking about the background of that because I know nothing about it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because remember what I said about sailing ships not being able to sail into the wind.
Right.
That meant you just can't, if you're trying to go there and the prevailing wind is coming at you, you just kind of can't do it with a lot of vessels. So sailing vessels were compelled to follow wind patterns, and they'd figured out by then that, you know, the wind tends to go this way, and then down here there's a wind that goes this way. All these prevailing winds meant that if you followed a certain pattern, you could get from A to B, but you might have to go to C and D and E first. And so vessels were compelled to follow these routes. They knew the winds, and they were using, yes, compasses and also, you know, sextants to get their bearing and, you know, keep time and figure out from the stars where you're at and all the rest to make sure that they were really good at being able to figure out where they were sort of north to south, but it was much harder for them to figure out how far east-west they were. But between the winds and experience, they were able to do that. So the answer to your question is, if you were typically trying to get directly from the west coast of England to the Bahamas, you'd have a wind problem. And usually you're trying to get to the Caribbean, you're trying to go south down past Spain, down to like the Cape Verde Islands off Africa, which are Spanish possession, or the Madeira, you know, where you stock up on Madeira wine. And then you could catch trade winds that would carry you across the Atlantic at those latitudes to enter the Caribbean through the Leeward Islands and eventually to the Bahamas. And it was almost like a conveyor belt. Like if you came and you arrived from the open Atlantic in the Caribbean, like down, you know, like Barbados and Martinique, that side of the Leeward Islands, you could keep proceeding very easily with the winds all the way to Jamaica and the Virgin Islands and Florida and the Bahamas. It was very hard for you to go backwards. So anytime, it was almost like a one-way journey, like a conveyor belt. Once you left Barbados, you were going to keep on going. And then once you got to the Straits of Florida, the Gulf Stream and other winds would carry you up the eastern seaboard. And then you could return across the Atlantic in that direction. But, you know, thus the triangle trade forms, right? The slave trade, you move, you know, trade goods and trinkets. You trade at the slave forts in Africa for enslaved people. You bring them with the trade winds across and you sell them. Then you take you exchange that for sugar and rum and the like, which you then bring the rest of the way. Not only with the goods, but the sequence you did was governed by the winds. And so that would be, so you'd be in a vessel that was going to make some of those journeys needs to be relatively large to carry enough supplies to do it. And for the mathematics and the economics of the vessel, it needs to carry enough stuff to make it profitable over time for the shareholders. So you're bigger vessels if you're going to be compelled to take a long route. But this also means, you know, people often ask, how did the pirates figure out where the ships were, given the ocean's big? Because of this, you knew where ships had to go, and there were certain choke points in world shipping where the intersection of the prevailing winds and the geography meant you knew that all kinds of ships had to pass through here and here. And one of the places that ships had to pass through was between the Bahama Islands and the shores of then uncolonized Florida was a choke point.
Which made Nassau such a perfect location.
So one of the reasons they ended up precisely there.
Okay. So roughly, as you said, it does vary based on if they have to go to B and C instead of just A to D, depending on the wind on certain parts of the journey. But on average, how long would a trip like that take to go from England to Nassau?
Well,
ballpark.
let's say you were going from New York or New England to England or vice versa. Typically that's like a 6-week trip back then. If you got to go down the coast of Africa and then to Nassau, and you're probably stopping on the way, longer. I'm not sure if I've timed that, but I think you're talking, 4, 5, 6 months anyway. You're going to be gone for more than a year by the time you finish the typical trade circuit, if you're going to do the circuit that's going to take you from England to the Caribbean via Africa.
Whoa.
And because you kind of have to go to, you could go to Madeira and pick up wine and then cross, and a lot of vessels did that who weren't involved in the slave trade. But part of the reason they encouraged the slave trade is, in the cruelty of the sort of capitalist economics of the era, you need to load that up with something. And that was, a compelling intersection of interests and profit that led you to, you already got to be down there for the trade winds. What are you going to carry across?
And you said they're obviously sizable. They have a lot of supplies on them. So discounting like some of the slave ships and stuff like that, how many people might be on a crew for one of those?
Right. Well, more on a slave ship because disease and bad diet and all these things meant that the mortality rate of the crews was staggering. So they often were carrying twice as many crew people than they needed to make up for the half who they knew would die on the way.
Whoa.
And much worse, of course, for the enslaved people chained in the hold, where it was just atrocious. But the conditions were really bad. There was a reason that people were fed up being merchant sailors. So in those cases, you're talking, probably 40, 50, I think, on things like La Concorde. Smaller
It's
vessels.
lower than I thought you'd say.
Yeah, a typical, pirates are often raiding, if you're raiding a ship that's going to be going back to England carrying logwood or rice from South Carolina, or sort of a typical ocean-going vessel, I don't know, you're probably talking 20 crewmen on some of those things in a merchant vessel. When you get to a warship, much more, because you're needing to man the guns and stuff. But, you're talking, 1 or 2 dozen is typically the number of people on a merchant vessel that the pirates are going to be encountering and dealing with. But you get up to, 100 or more when you're dealing with warships.
All right. So you had said the guy Henry Avery was the mysterious dude who ended up disappearing back into somewhere in the UK or Ireland after beginning this whole thing. And part of it was, you said he laid the track works for Nassau and what that became as a haven. And then after him, I guess for the golden era, you have these guys, Henry Jennings and Hornigold.
Benjamin Hornigold
enter the picture. What were they were very different people, but they were doing the same thing, I guess. What were their backgrounds and how did they end up in Nassau?
Yeah, so they're kind of the co-founders and rival founders of the Pirate Republic in Nassau. So that war ended, the War of Spanish Succession. You had all these people who, for various reasons, might want to become pirates. And some of them wound up in the Bahamas and Nassau. And one of the early ones was Benjamin Hornigold, arrived there with some of these periaguas, these canoes I described. He had 3 great big ones and a crew. Blackbeard might have been with him at the time before he was known as Blackbeard. And they were operating out of Nassau. Why were they operating out of Nassau? Because during the War of Spanish Succession, the French and Spanish had sacked the English colony of the Bahamas twice and pretty much obliterated. It was a failed colony. The fort was damaged. There's no imperial authorities there whatsoever. These early pirates, Hornigold and others, arrived there before England bothered to send somebody to govern the place again. They moved in first. They're the ones who started shoring up the fort to defend the harbor and make it impossible to remove them. So the pirates moved into a failed colony and kind of took over the infrastructure and repaired it. Hornigold was one of the ones who did that, and he got there early and was sort of he'd been a privateer previously, and he had a lot of gumption, a lot of reservations about attacking English ships. He was like, oh, it's cool, let's go keep attacking the Spanish. We just fought a war with them, we don't like them, but we're not going to attack English ships and ships from our own country. And that would create friction later on, but he was kind of, he had a sort of moral compass about what he was doing. He was trying to continue operating as a privateer. And the people under him tended to have a little bit more of a pirate honor code than some of the people who served under Jennings. Jennings shows up later. Jennings is from a wealthier background. He had some kind of plantation or farm on Jamaica. He'd been a merchant captain and a privateering captain prior and during the War of Spanish Succession. And was, worth a fair bit of money at the time, was a respectable person in Jamaica.
Did he have family lineage to power structures in the UK?
Not that we know of. I mean, what we were able to put together from the surviving documents is that he had an estate that was worth quite a bit. He shows up in merchant shipping records and customs records, and sometimes in the accounts in the only newspaper that was around in North America at the time. Respectable and successful merchant captain, upward bourgeoisie. And Jamaica was the most important and wealthiest English colony in the Caribbean. That was the base of the Royal Navy's fleet. That was where all the kind of money was. That was the chunkiest colony in the English Empire, and he was there. So he's, a very successful colonial, upper middle class sort of person, if you want to try to use today's terms on it. And he's involved in a political struggle. Right. On top of all of this other stuff I've talked about, there was a subset of pirates, including Jennings, who weren't the downtrodden masses I just described, right? Jennings is a pretty respectable figure. He's got an estate. He's got plenty to lose. What's he doing with all these disgruntled proles, right? What's up with that? And there's a number of them, right? Palsgrave Williams of Rhode Island, who Sam Bellamy's sidekick and becomes a pirate captain and commodore himself, was the son of Rhode Island's Attorney General. Well, maybe that's not a total surprise, but his mother was descended from the Plantagenet kings of England, right? And he's in there on the piracy. There's all,
a little corruption in Rhode Island politics? Come on. Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.